Okay, so this paper is it's a work in progress. I started it last year after I became outraged by this particular idea of the Afropolitan or Afropolitanism. So I am looking forward to feedback, and I feel super nervous that I'm referencing Sadef's work, and she's here, so no pressure. But so I'm looking forward to the feedback, any kind of constructive criticisms that you have. In Sadef Eric Koch's New Whitenesses, Beyond the Color Line, Assessing the Contradictions and Complexities of Whiteness in the Geopolitical Economy of Capitalist Globalism, she cautions us against new arrangements of whiteness in the neoliberal global capitalist moment, a moment in which the perception that we are post-race functions to deny and mask insidious forms of structural inequality and white supremacy. Essentially, Eric Koch argues that with the advent of contemporary global capitalism and post-Cold War politics, whiteness as a stable category has been disrupted at the same moment it repositions itself as superior through codified language. Even as class becomes more salient in terms of global structural inequality, the historical racial logic of white supremacy still undergirds our contemporary capitalist relations. She points to 3 examples in which the racial logic of whiteness becomes reconfigured or allows for cracks in the color line while simultaneously reasserting itself as the dominant narrative. First, she examines the post-Cold War period in which debates about who is authentically European has created a racial divide between Eastern and Western Europeans, with Western Europe being proffered as a desirable European whiteness. Secondly, Eric Koch points to the end of the social welfare state in Europe and the rise of neoliberalism as a moment in which accusations of laziness and moral bankruptcy are hurled at cash-poor whites. In this moment, working-class white Europeans lose the privileges that were historically associated with white citizenship. And lastly, Eric Koch examines what she calls the transnational bourgeoisie, or the formerly third world elite, who enter whiteness through economic status and purchasing power. The move from import substitution to export-oriented economies in the global south has created a small group of well-traveled, Western-educated elites who have more in common with other affluent members of the global south and white Western bodies than their local populations. For Eric Koch, this attempt to mimic or claim whiteness, quote, does not simply represent colonial victimization or psychological damage, but rather becomes an active strategy used by some groups to claim power and superiority over others in the same society. In considering this last category, the transnational bourgeoisie, I will discuss the emergence of a new class of people referred to as Afropolitans to illustrate how traditionally non-white bodies enter whiteness via consumerism, the privilege of mobility, and access to world markets. I am particularly interested here in how Afropolitanism functions as a marker of exceptionalism in the African context, based on one's ability to traverse national borders and mimic white Western values. Some of the key questions here for me include, how do the traditional racial and class categories of middle-class whiteness show up in the discourse, representation, and articulation of Afropolitan values? And in which ways does this new class position actually reify the project of white supremacy? I will demonstrate that the Afropolitan label is still limited in that it empowers the select few who, through a posturing of cosmopolitan modernity, global consumption, and exceptional Africanness, are able to leverage their class privilege within this current political moment. While the term is intended to liberate, as one blogger puts it, Afropolitan naively perpetuates a very real class and racial divide, reflecting what Eric Koch refers to as the whitening of the transnational bourgeoisie. With the rise of this small but significant racialized middle class stepping into positions of power historically reserved for whites, Eric Koch argues that a contemporary analysis of whiteness can and must be understood in terms of cracks in the color line. Ultimately, Afropolitans constitute a class all on their own that have been able to slip through the cracks in the color line, as it were. So while this is a term that is still quite in its early stages of development, there have been key texts that attempt to articulate who exactly an Afropolitan is and what makes them so. Diasporic African community initiatives in the realm of art and fashion, as well as business and entrepreneurship, have heralded this new class of African elites as the burgeoning hope of Africa, poised to transform the continent. In February of 2012, CNN.com published an article entitled Young, Urban, and Culturally Savvy Meets the Afropolitans, showcasing Africa's greatest exports, a young and successful urbanized cohort with a global outlook. A popular feminist blogger and fashion designer, Mina Salami, who manages a site called Miss Afropolitan, describes the Afropolitan in three ways. She writes, Afropolitan, a combination of the words African and cosmopolitan. 1, a multi-dimensional African influenced by the diaspora. 2, someone who identifies with Africa, but also other regions and cultures of the world. And 3, a person of African descent who is passionate to change perceptions of Africa. Prior to this publication, however, the first major essay to articulate Afropolitanism was published by Thais Selassie in 2005 for Lit magazine. The article entitled Bye Bye Babar presents an exciting case for a new generation of elite African youth who have grown up, worked, and lived between multiple countries and sometimes regions of the world. The Afropolitan is a hybrid of identities influenced by their many travels as well as their African ethos, signaling a shift amongst the growing African middle class in the expression and celebration of their worldly status. As Selassie writes, they, read we, are Afropolitans, the newest generation of African immigrants coming soon or collected already at a law firm, chem lab, jazz lounge near you. You'll know us by our funny blend of London fashion, New York jargon, African ethics, and academic successes. Some of us are ethnic mixes, such as Ghanaian and Canadian, Nigerian and Swiss, others merely cultural mutts. American accent, European affect, African ethos. Most of us are multilingual. In addition to English and a romantic or two, we understand some indigenous tongue and speak a few urban vernaculars. There is at least one place on the African continent to which we tie our sense of self, be it a nation state like Ethiopia, a city like Abidjan, or an auntie's kitchen. Then there's the G8 city or 2 or 3 that we know like the back of our hands, and the various institutions that know us for our famed focus. We are Afropolitans, not citizens, but Africans of the world. Within this description of the Afropolitan, we see at least 3 features of a transnational bourgeoisie who symbolically enter whiteness by way of the class structures embedded in the global economic system. Firstly, the Afropolitan, read the transnational elite, is said to be a modern subject with exposure to various cultural experiences from around the world. She is an ethnic mix, a well-educated, read Western-educated, English or your respective European language speaking, highly successful African. Selassie affectionately uses the term cultural mutts to describe a class of people that through their dilution are somehow exceptionally African. As Eric Koch notes, the widening of the economic gap caused by neoliberal shifts, such as export-based economies, has ensured that a small group of people from the former third world may exclusively vie for economic power in their countries and abroad, essentially granting them access to a white, Western, opulent lifestyle. In the context of the global South, or former third world, the Afropolitan's economic access functions as the white social capital that facilitates their easy mobility across national and regional borders, even as the majority of African people continue to, quote, find themselves more deeply trapped in a north-south divide, end quote. This glorification of the culturally blended, read better, more exciting, modern, and Western African already sets up a binary between those who can and should access globalization and those who will be left behind. We are to infer from the definition above that the Afropolitan exists in this culturally ambiguous space, which is only really accessible to particular kinds of formerly third world bodies on the backdrop of Western whiteness, of course. Secondly, I worry that the term Afropolitanism is a politically strategic move to distinguish oneself figuratively from the rest of the African population. From the above definition, we are to assume that the Afropolitan is neither a working class or rural class African on the continent, nor are they to be counted amongst the numerous de-skilled African immigrants or political refugees settled in Western cities. Rather, the Afropolitan is the ultimate liberal subject. Their many travels across industrialized urban centers, their savvy code switching between local dialects and the languages of the G8 city or 2 or 3, and their circle of highly professionalized and educated friends positions them as already and always in a state of modernity. And while Afropolitans may express a passion to change perceptions of Africa, I argue that the term actually works to alienate those who do not have access to a global outlook in which they are able to leverage on the international economic market. A third way that the Afropolitan assumes the role of a transnational bourgeois is the ways in which they are literally spatially segregated from the masses of African people. Eric Koch argues that one of the most visible ways in which middle classes in the global South come into whiteness is through their spatial segregation from local populations. The reorganization of urban centers, the withdrawal of the middle classes from public sphere, and the creation of gated suburbs across African cities allow Africa's middle classes to imagine themselves as part of the global elite. As an extension of this local separation, however, one sees the spatial demarcation replicated on the international stage. Selassie writes that the Afropolitan, quote, belongs to no single geography, but feels at home in many, end quote. At a time where it is becoming increasingly difficult for local Africans to access international visas, when Western countries continue to impose rigid immigration requirements, and country development is concentrated predominantly in Africa's urban centers, I wonder who is allowed access to these multiple homes or geographies that Selassie writes about. Indeed, in the above example, the Afropolitan defines home outside of any tangible connection to their country's larger population. It is simply not a requirement. They simultaneously exist in multiple geographical spaces, yet do not actually interact or share space with local realities. This cosmopolitan posturing suggests that Afropolitans increasingly align themselves and feel most comfortable with white Western values of material access and cosmopolitanism, often at the expense of the majority of the global South. It also means they run the risk of becoming completely disconnected from the realities of the average citizen. Further, I argue that this ability to feel at home, that is, to feel completely acclimatized, appreciated, and embraced as a world traveler, is in part rooted in the tenets of European colonial expansionism. What does it mean then for historically marginalized groups now entering a global transnational elite status to boastfully mimic Europe's colonial habits? And yet, I am also quite sensitive to the political impulse of Afropolitanism. The appeal of this cultural phenomenon lies in its vagueness. In a sense, because the term has been loosely defined, it appears that anyone may lay claim to Afropolitanism. The term is sexy because it allows individuals who have never really felt at home in one place, who have had a myriad of experiences that have shaped them, to anchor their identities in something new and exciting. Secondly, one must appreciate the effort of individuals to rework infamously harmful narratives of Africa in the face of continued misrepresentation. In essence, it is a rebranding of the African. And of course, much has been written about the lack of care and respect dealt to Africa and its people in the past and present. Many can concur that the world has not done its due diligence to understand Africa for all of its complexities and has instead opted to pigeonhole the continent and its people as a deserted, war-torn, dark mess. Certainly, the concept opens up space for a particular class of people bored with images of Africa as poor and destitute, to reimagine themselves. However, I am skeptical of any move to reimagine African identity that aligns itself with neoliberal capitalist values such as consumerism and the marginalization of non-urban and rural life from notions of progress. Nor do I endorse a reimagining that does not consider the material conditions of the majority of Africans. What happens when we create our own mythographies of Africa and the reality for the masses of what it means to be African in the contemporary world? On the surface, Afropolitanism seems like an innocent reclamation of African dignity. However, the celebration of this identity unintentionally masks the increasing structural inequality within African countries, which then invalidates any collective claim to racial justice, decolonization, and state reform. As Paul Gilroy notes, it takes us away from the, quote, disreputable angry places where the political interests of racialized minorities might be identified and worked upon without being encumbered by an affected liberal innocence. Afropolitanism also creates a dangerous binary in which one is either the poor, unmodernized village African, or they are an Afropolitan, a respectable Negro, as it were. In this way, Afropolitanism speaks to our own anxieties as Africans in a white supremacist world. Indeed, the attempts to be African in the whitest ways possible suggests that we continue to take instruction from our colonial past about what should constitute models of success and excellence on our continent. In this move, we ultimately recenter whiteness at the very post-racial moment in which we are supposed to believe it has disappeared or become less relevant to questions of power and privilege. Thank you.